There is a great deal which we do not know about the human universe. I mean, the first thing is to make people aware that we do not know. There is a great lack of knowledge. We are not yet clear that our human world is, to a large extent, an undiscovered world. We do not really understand ourselves. And that is the central task, as I understand it, of sociology, to gain more certain knowledge of the human level of the universe which we form with each other. Let us try. My feeling is that we will be able to produce more knowledge which has a practical application than we do today. But you may say, I can't prove it. Is that what you say?
No.
Well, I mean, this is indeed what I personally think, that sociologists could produce more knowledge which is practically useful for vital problems of our living together.
Right, sir. Right. Righto, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Yes, young lady? In you go. Righto, dear. Bag, young lady, please. Open the bags up here, please. Here, please.
How long have you been visiting the British Museum Library?
Oh, my God. I think it is since 1935.
And you have been coming regularly?
With some intervals, fairly regularly. I did the book on the civilizing process almost entirely from the sources of the British Museum. And quite frankly speaking, I do what I am doing now on time, almost exclusively on the material I find in the British Museum. So for me, this is home from home. For instance, at the moment I work on the problem of time, and so I go here to the subject and find throughout the years, from the end of the 19th century to the present, something under the subject time. I look it up. Time. There are 3 interesting books. Now I look them up in the actual catalogue. There was a book on the philosophy of time. So I looked that up. Let me see. Can you follow me? Mavorsky. I look it up. These heavy volumes. You can imagine that I'm very conscious of time because I am between 77 and 78 years, and so one begins to feel time directly. I'm a German Jew. I left Germany at an age where I was neither a student nor a professor, but an in-between person, which is about the most difficult thing to imagine. I was quite aware of the fact, I mean, one is being made aware of the fact that one is not a born Englishman. If one speaks with so strong an accent as I have, this way of life has made me more aware probably than most people how dependent one is on other people. I cannot live alone or without a set of friends. If one is so pronounced a person as I am, it's not easy always to find that kind of human relationship which one needs. We have nothing but ourselves. We, mankind, flying on this lonely little planet, there is no greater task, no other task really, than before destroying ourselves to find out how we can arrange our lives in such a way that we do not constantly hurt ourselves and also gain as much pleasurable excitement and satisfaction as we can. You will rightly say, how do we do it? Right. Now, another aspect of what I have to say is that one cannot do it by allowing one's wishes to dominate one's thinking. We all wish very much for the same. But by allowing our wishes to dominate our thinking, we prevent us from doing the first thing which has to be done. And that is to find out how our life together really works. Most of the present ways of orienting oneself are based on the wish of getting away from the continuous change in which we live. One wants to find the permanent behind all changes. Whether one wants to find it in the laws of God or in the laws of nature or in the eternity of human existence, our whole thinking is informed by this intense wish for permanence, for that which is unchanging. Now, I think that as long as this is the value system which dominates our thinking, we shall not be able to orientate ourselves realistically, and I very advisedly use the term realistically, in our world, because we live in a world of continuous change. And so my own thinking is directed towards conceptualizing, towards investigating the order of change rather than anything unchanging behind all changes. In the early 19th century, there were a number of thinkers whom we all know, who thought more or less in the same terms. There was Hegel, who thought in dynamic terms, in terms of a continuous flux. There was, above all, Marx. There was, to some extent, Comte, and there was Darwin, the theory of evolution. Marx, I should almost say, discovered that in the development of mankind, what he called the economic sphere, or in more popular terms, the way in which men produce the necessities of their lives, and particularly their food, plays a central part. I believe that no one can go back behind this insight. The class struggle is fundamental for my own thinking. But when that is said, I have to add the unsolved problem with which we are confronted today is that those who oppose oppressors, once they have become victorious, become on a broader basis and with more humanitarian ideologies, oppressors themselves. Marx dealt only or mainly with the problem of economic monopolization. This was an important discovery, but he did not yet deal with the problem with which I have dealt extensively, namely with the monopolization of physical violence in the form of another state monopoly. And the problem with which I from now on will deal most is the problem of increasing affect control, because this too is one of the elementary sources of the dynamics of societies. It revolves around the question in what way the elementary animalic impulses of men in a society are controlled either through external control or controls to be believed external or to self-controls. And with that problem, I'm going to deal now. Let me say a word about the use of affective controls as a means of power. I think the most obvious example which I can give you at the moment is the control which men have exercised for a very long time over the emotional and libidinal satisfactions of women. For a very long time, parents were intent on the virginity of their daughters as a means of control, as a means of preserving their own interest, because a daughter was a valuable property in a sense. She could make a better marriage if she was a virgin. And so far as the husband was concerned, it was in his interest to have the monopoly of the enjoyment of her body, but also he wanted to be quite sure that his property would go to his own blood, as we call it. So in all these senses, the balance of power between the sexes found expression in the balance of power in restraints, as men were very much more powerful than women. But if the balance tilts and becomes more equal, the whole relationship becomes very much more difficult. Do not be misled by this desire for greater equality, which we all share. Do see that this means a much more difficult relationship. Greater equality, lesser unevenness of the balance of power means greater restraints on all sides. We have somehow the feeling that it is something quite new in our own time that young people can kiss in public and go arm in arm. Now, this is a little book probably designed for the amusement and pleasure of a wealthy knight, perhaps a duke, perhaps a prince. Here, this is their way of doing it, their way of what we might call necking, is absolutely taken for granted. Here in the Middle Ages, you see the young knights going with their girls about. And as you see, it's a particular pleasure for them to also show in the same picture the pain and punishment of meted out to unruly servants of the lower classes. They are completely unconcerned. Obviously, the patron enjoyed seeing the rape of a village, how the poor peasants are knifed, how the poor peasant who is just escaping here is kept back by the end of his shirt, and the proud knight will in a moment kill him. One enjoys doing it. They were much less sensitive with regard to suffering of human beings than we are normally in our everyday life. we are at the moment in part concerned with the problem of outbreaks of violence. And we think it's quite terrible. We are one of the most violent times there ever was. But this is not the case. We are one of the least violent times there ever were.
6 drivers from the family coach business carried the coffin, the family wreaths on top. Behind the coffin, Leslie's mother, Mrs. Dorothy Whittle, was supported by Leslie's brother Ronald and her aunt. Among the mourners were Detective Chief Superintendent Bob Booth, who led the kidnap inquiry, and senior officers of West Mercia Police.
What individual could put his
She
hand
was 70 years
to
old.
such atrocities as the person who has been responsible for this has done, who was not possessed by the devil? This is indeed the work of the devil.
I always feel that
He has put
we are not aware of the fact how much more we are sheltered against violence than most previous centuries. The whole police force is engaged in trying to find the murderer. In former days, probably there was neither such a police force available. There was the hue and cry of the local village at the most, perhaps a century and a half ago. Today, it is the whole police force, and although we have the feeling, and not entirely wrongly, that violence, mugging, has a little increased, as indeed it has, compared with previous centuries, I think we lead a very secure life, and we are not quite conscious of that. And today, rightly, we expect the state to do something about it, but also we dislike, and equally rightly, that the state gains by doing all these things so much more power. All right. In former days, people had to be far more afraid of each other because there was no security. And you still have that in very large parts of Africa. It is only our enormous lack of imagination which does not allow us to put ourselves in the place of people who live in a society in which violence, disease, sexual violence is always around the corner. And of course, to some extent, they react to that with what we call superstition, which means really in their anxiety, they seek at least the imaginary protection by spirits. They cannot help that because this is the only way in which they can survive all the anxiety which their life brings to them. And an example is this. I knew, for instance, from literature, Greek literature or the Bible, that people make animal sacrifices to their gods. This, for us, has become thinned as a piece of literary metaphor, making sacrifice to God. But I wanted to see it. I wanted to be there when actually a priest earnestly and seriously killed a lamb or a dove or whatever it is and sung to his gods in order to understand what it feels like if that is done living in a society where one kills animals behind the scenes. Well, now, look at all these masks. There's nothing false, no self-consciousness, no mannerism in this art because the feeling is strong, direct, elementary, you might say sometimes crude. Of course, one has to ask oneself how it was that what we call now African art, what is African art, and all its immense richness and variety, up to the beginning of the century, was regarded as the expression, the incomprehensible expression of people who did not know better. People, European people, up to the beginning of the century were blind artistically. Something was blocked. One did not see it. And then, when similar needs, you might say, informed the art creation of Europe, then suddenly one discovered this as a model, to some extent, of European art. You know that Picasso and others collected these pieces, and since then it has never lost its hold over the imagination of European artists. So let me explain the problem as I see it. Here, the masks are external and communal. In Europeans, the masks are internal and individualized. As the individual mask, the internalized mask, grew stronger and thicker. We use a variety of expressions: conscience, superego, ego, whatever you want, as internally the control of the emotions through self-control grew stronger. People for a very long time in their official art, in court art, in the Victorian art, tried simply to reproduce things as they saw them. They were, as we call it, naturalistic and emotionally, extraordinarily controlled or inhibited, whichever you choose. Now, the problem which I touch upon in terms of external and internal mask is this. In the earlier stages of social development, men can largely learn to control their impulses communally. And it is in that sense the external pressure which the community as a whole exercises upon them, which is represented by these masks. The masks are the embodiment of the communal pressure to control themselves through awe and fear. In other words, as we know in a child, the controls are as wild, strong, ferocious, if you want to say, as the animalic impulses themselves. And some of this emotionality you find in these faces. These masks, some of them are very, you might say, wild fantasies, something which might be a nightmare if you dream of it, if this as a person comes to you. Shows something which we know from theoretically, that if the impulses are extremely wild, as they are in every little child initially, then the child imagines that the mother, in curbing these impulses, is equally wild. If the child wants to bite the mother, the child imagines that the mother wants to bite the child. So something of this wildness of the controls of which these masks exercise over people reflects the wildness of the lower, more elementary layers of the superego. But however it is, in addition to the state controls or to the controls which a couple mutually exercise upon each other in a family, and even the children exercise upon their parents, in addition to those, in societies such as ours, we grow and build up in our children very strong self-controls, not only in the original sense, but these self-controls grow into the flesh. They become automatic. They are also built in blindly. No one really knows how to do it. So we find that in certain periods these controls have been built in so cruelly, so strongly, as for instance in all the taboos against sex, against mentioning defecation or mentioning any of the animalic aspects of men which we had growing and which I have shown as growing in my book on the civilizing process, that people at the beginning of the 20th century began to revolt, not consciously, but to some extent against the overwhelming puritanical strength of the anti-animalic built-in taboos, and this found expression in art, among others in the greater emotionality of the art, in the release of stronger colors. It found expression in music, in the stronger, wilder beat of the music. It found expression in many other ways, but it was, again, a blind revolt against the self-destructive and overwhelming strength of the built-in taboos. I have all along the feeling that men today and in the past have not really come to terms with their own animality. Partly the civilizing process which we have undergone is an attempt to suppress their animality, and very often cruelly, and to banish it out of sight as much as we can. If you look at the disguised animals walking around the street, the disguised human animals, you become aware of the fact that we rather try to suppress or conceal from ourselves our animality than to cope with it in order to lead a human life. Perhaps I should express it in the following terms. We are born animals, but in order to become human, we have to make an effort, and the effort does not include the need to suppress, but only to control to some extent our animality. I think this problem of how to become human, being animals, that is a problem which we have to face up more directly than we have so far done. And this includes, for instance, the aggressiveness, the mutual killing, like animals. We cannot live a reasonable life with each other as humans, which is really at the heart of all I try to bring out, unless one is able to exercise some controls over oneself. But it is equally true that very often these controls are built in blindly, so strongly, so immensely, that it defeats the legitimate right of an individual to self-enjoyment, to the pleasurable excitement which is part of our life and of which I shall see.
Come in, hold it.
It is interesting to find that all our leisure activities run under a false flag. We think and we say that in our leisure time we want relaxation of tensions. The opposite is the case. In our leisure time, we set out for tensions, only for tensions of a particular type, for pleasurable tensions, or, as I called it, for pleasurable excitement. Football. Football is essentially poised between two equally unpleasant poles. A football game can have very little tension. Both sides are more or less equal and the game runs on and on. Then it becomes boring. Or else the game works up to such a heat that the tension becomes serious and ends in a riot and in violence between the two sides. The skill of the game is to keep up the tension between the two sides at a level sufficient to counter boredom and not sufficient to lead to a physical, serious struggle of violence. That it is constantly poised at this thin borderline between boredom and riot. That is precisely what I mean. If we speak of a civilizing process, one does not mean that we are civilized. Far from it. One means a change in the direction which I have just outlined, where one is able to find satisfaction for one's emotional urges and needs in such a way that one gains from them pleasurable excitement, the pleasurable excitement which they promise to give us without hurting each other, without doing violence to each other, and without losing control over oneself and losing one's own dignity, one's own human dignity, or on the other side, without falling into boredom. This is a problem which we have not yet solved. Well, I have managed to catch this train, just. I am happily settled here, and I can now reflect on the problem which, more than any other, occupies my mind at the moment, the problem of time. I was punctual. I just managed to catch the train. It is a terrible compulsion. I think you all realize that time has an enormous compelling force. And yet, we actually don't know what it is. It compels us. And perhaps in societies such as ours, more than in any other society. We live with the very urgent feeling that time is passing. That is how we speak. Time is passing. We are very much awake to the fact that while we do this, time is running away. Now, Is it time which is passing? Or is it merely a figure of speech for saying for expressing our awareness that our life is passing? We are so aware of the fact that we are getting older, that we count the years of our life. So our time experience is closely connected with our whole knowledge of the fact that we are in a constant condition of biological flux. We are now 30 years, now 40 years, now 50 years, now 60 years. Our awareness of this is enormously sharp through our social upbringing. But there are very many societies who have no standard for measuring years. Of course, they have a feeling that they may grow weaker when what we call they grow older. But their sense of time passing or time being minutely subdivided is not there because they have no clocks, they have no watches. They may look perhaps perfunctorily after the sun, and in fact the sun serves them as a clock or as a watch. But how undifferentiated is really the sun as a clock compared with our watches? That is why you find, for instance, now when in many developing countries, considerable difficulties which people have to adjust themselves to a tempo of life which is different from that which they had. Their personality structure has to adjust itself to the new way of living where they have to go morning punctually into the office or into the workshop. That was not the life of a peasant society where they went into the fields and caught the corn whenever it was necessary or hunted the animals when they were hungry. There was no other urgency initially than their own impulses. Their hunger had to be satisfied. They timed it accordingly. But we have to time it in accordance with the enormously finely graded interdependence of our life in society. In that respect, as you can see, it links up very closely with the theory of civilizing processes because the shell of time, institutional and in terms of self-compulsion, is so finely graded. You will fit into the voice lots of these periods. Listen, how time is running away. I wish you all the pleasurable excitement one can have without hurting others and one's own dignity.